I've been on the force for nearly 20 years now, patrolling the same small city in a rural county that borders a state park. It's a quiet place, and crime is mostly petty thefts or the occasional bar fight. Over the years, I've seen my fair share of oddities, but nothing could have prepared me for that night a few years ago. It was just another night shift, patrolling the quiet streets with my partner Andrew. We were doing our usual rounds when a call came in over the radio from dispatch. A local had reported a possible break-in. The caller was vague, saying someone might be trying to break into their house. Break-ins are rare here, so Andrew and I immediately perked up. I grabbed the address and switched on the lights, heading straight there. We pulled into the driveway, and I instantly recognized the house. It belonged to Henry, an older man known around town as a local drunk. I thought it seemed more likely that Henry had a few too many rather than there being an actual break-in. Andrew shot me a look, rolling his eyes, and I knew he was thinking the same thing. Still, we got out of the car, flashlight in hand, and approached cautiously. I went up to the front door while Andrew circled around to check the side of the house. I knocked, and Henry answered almost immediately. I asked him what was going on, expecting a rambling story about shadows or noises. Instead, Henry told me he'd been watching TV when he heard a noise from the backyard. His dog had started barking like crazy, so he got up to check. When he opened the back door, his dog bolted out towards the large shed at the back of his property. Henry followed the dog to the porch and shined his flashlight outside. He said he saw someone, move into his shed. He insisted it wasn't an animal, it was walking on two legs. I nodded, keeping my face neutral, but something about the way Henry's dog was hiding under the table, whimpering, sent a shiver up my spine. I told Henry to stay inside and lock the door. I made my way out back, moving towards the shed, where I saw Andrew standing, his gun drawn. This stopped me in my tracks. Andrew wasn't the type to draw his weapon unless absolutely necessary. I approached slowly, my own hand hovering over my holster. I quietly asked him what was going on. He mentioned for me to come closer. I could see his hand trembling, his gun still aimed at the shed. I'd never seen Andrew this shaken before. He was always calm, collected. Seeing him like that put me on edge. I asked him again what was going on. He said he didn't know, his voice barely above a whisper. But then he said there's something in there, and it's not human. Before I could ask him what he meant, a loud bang echoed from inside the shed. I drew my gun, aiming it at the door. My heart was pounding. I shouted for whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. There was a moment of silence, and then we heard a noise that sent chills down my spine. A mix between a hiss and a howl, unlike anything I've ever heard. I shined my flashlight towards the shed and saw a pair of eyes reflecting back at me from the darkness. A figure stepped forward, slowly moving into the beam of my light. What I saw, it defied all logic. It looked like some unholy mix between a human and an alligator, standing on two legs. Its face was elongated, like a reptile's, but its body was vaguely humanoid, with long arms that ended in webbed claws. I stepped back instinctively, my gun shaking in my hands. I glanced at Andrew, who was as pale as a ghost, his eyes wide with terror. We both knew there was no protocol for this. What do you do when you're faced with something that shouldn't exist? The creature let out another blood-curdling noise and suddenly charged at us. I fell backwards, firing my gun. I honestly don't even know if any of my rounds hit it, but if they did, they had no effect. The creature moved faster than anything I'd ever seen and vanished into the dense woods behind the shed. Andrew helped me to my feet, both of us breathing hard, our minds struggling to process what we had just witnessed. From the front porch we heard Henry shouting, asking us what was happening. Andrew fumbled for his radio, calling for backup, but he didn't say what we'd seen. How could he? Who would believe us? Within minutes, more squad cars arrived. The police chief was among them, demanding an explanation. Andrew and I exchanged a glance. There was no way that we could tell them the truth. It was too insane, too unbelievable. It was a bear, Andrew finally said, his voice steadying as he spoke the lie. I nodded in agreement. We both wrote up our statements, each detailing some fabricated story of a bear attack. Henry didn't question it. He hadn't seen the creature himself, and that was probably for the best. Andrew and I never spoke about that night again, but every time I patrol near the edge of those woods, I find myself glancing into the darkness, wondering if it's still out there, watching, wondering if it will come back. I was a cop for nearly 30 years, patrolling the streets of one of the largest cities in the country. You see a lot in that line of work. Things that stay with you, haunt you. I'd witnessed the depths of human depravity, cruelty that defied reason, but I could always find a way to explain it, make sense of it somehow. Until one call came in, a call that defied all logic, a call I still can't explain. It was a quiet night, one of those rare moments when the city seemed to hold its breath. I was driving with my partner Jack. We'd been on the force together for years. We knew the routine, the dance of danger and duty that played out each shift. We were about to call it a night when the dispatch crackled over the radio. A neighbor reported screams coming from a house on a rough side of town. They weren't sure if it was an assault or something worse, but they wanted someone to check it out. Jack glanced at me. He said we should probably take this one, and I nodded. I told dispatch we'd check it out and call if we need to back up. We flipped on the sirens and sped towards the address. As we pulled up to the house, everything seemed still. The streetlights cast long shadows across the cracked pavements, and an eerie silence settled over the neighborhood. Jack got out and went around the side of the house while I approached the front door. I knocked loudly, announcing that we were police, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time, and the porch light flicked on. The door creaked open, and an older woman peeked out. She looked frail, her eyes wide with fear. I introduced myself and told her we had gotten a call of someone potentially in distress. I then told her we would need to check out the area. She shook her head. She said everything was fine, but I could tell she was lying. I'd seen that look way too many times before. Jack joined me on the porch, and I tried again. I told her that if there was anyone inside that was hurt or trying to hurt her, we could help. Before she could respond, a scream erupted from deep within the house, a scream that didn't sound human. My gaze went from the woman and back to Jack. I drew my gun, looking at the woman. She started to cry, pleading with us. She said, "You don't understand, you have to leave. Leave now." But there was no way we could just walk away now. I gently pushed her aside and forced the door open. I told the woman to sit on the porch. She didn't fight it. Jack and I stepped inside, guns drawn. The house was dark, shadows lurking in every corner. "Police," I shouted. "If there's anyone here, come out with your hands up." Nothing. The silence was suffocating as we cleared room after room, each one more oppressive than the last. Finally, we reached a door at the end of a long hallway. I could feel something was off, like a cold draft seeping through the cracks. I looked at Jack, and he nodded. I reached for the doorknob, but it was locked from the inside. I yelled if they didn't come to the door, I was gonna come in. No response. I kicked the door with all my might, and it flew open. Inside, an old man lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling with eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. His pupils were so dilated they looked like black holes, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. I asked him if he was alright, lowering my weapon just slightly. He didn't respond, but his eyes flicked towards me, sending a shiver down my spine. Then he chuckled, a low, guttural sound that didn't seem to belong to a human being. "Hello, Christopher," he said in a voice that, well, honestly, I don't even know how to describe it. Let's just say it wasn't his voice. My heart stopped. How did he know my name? I'd never seen this man in my life before. Before I could react, he sprang up from the bed with an unnatural speed, landing on the floor in a crouch. Jack and I stepped back, our guns aimed at him. He turned his head towards me, tilting in a way that seemed to defy anatomy. "Do you have a message for your sister?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. "I'd be happy to deliver it to her." I stood there, unable to move. My sister. I hadn't spoken of her in years. She struggled with her mental health and had taken her own life a few years back. She tried to call me before she did it, but I was on duty, too busy to answer. It's a regret that's haunted me ever since. But how could he possibly know about that? I felt tears well up in my eyes, a mix of fear and guilt washing over me. I backed into the wall, my mind racing. Jack was now shouting, demanding the man get on the ground. The man looked at Jack. "Oh, Jackie," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Your wife would be so disappointed if she knew about Sabrina." Jack's face turned white. He looked at me, panic in his eyes. The man laughed again, a chilling, inhuman sound that echoed the room. Then, his body began to contort, his limbs bending at impossible angles. We watched in horror, paralyzed by the grotesque display, and then, as suddenly as it started, he collapsed onto the floor, motionless. I snapped out of it and radioed for backup and an ambulance. As the medics wheeled the old man out, I saw the woman sitting on the couch, her face streaked with tears. I approached her, unsure of what to say. She looked up at me with a sorrowful expression. "I told you not to go back there," she whispered. I couldn't bring myself to respond. "It's the devil, you know," she continued, her voice barely audible. I stared at her, a chill running down my spine. Later, I found out the name Jackie was what Jack's mother used to call him. He admitted to an affair with a woman named Sabrina, something I'd never known about. We never spoke of that night again, but I knew, deep down, that we had come face to face with something beyond our understanding. Something evil, and as much as I tried to rationalize it, to fit it into the framework of logic and reason I'd built my life around, I knew there was no explanation. It was the devil, and I'd looked him in the eye. I've been a cop in this small rural town for almost 15 years now. With a force of just 13 officers, there's not much action. The biggest excitement is usually a cow getting loose or a drunk brawl at one of the two bars. Nothing ever happens here. We have a low crime rate, and everyone knows everyone. You could say it's boring, but I like it that way. It was a Thursday night, just after sunset. I was at the local gas station, grabbing a cup of coffee to get me through another night patrol. I knew I wouldn't see a soul after midnight. A few hours passed, and I was parked in the empty lot of the local grocery store, sipping my coffee and flipping through the radio stations. That's when my cell phone rang. It was dispatch. It was Brenda, one of our dispatchers. She said she had a weird one for me. One of the farmers, old man Hank, called in saying that he thought someone was in his fields. The cows were going nuts, and he thought he saw a flashing light outside. She asked if I could go check it out. I told her I would head there now. I hung up, feeling a slight twinge of curiosity. Hank was a good guy, not one to overreact. If he was calling, something must have really spooked him. I pulled out of the lot and made my way to his farm, the night growing darker around me. As I drove, I thought about what it could be. Maybe coyotes were spooking the cattle or some kids messing with a flashlight. Still, Hank was a seasoned farmer. He would have handled coyotes himself. Something wasn't right. I pulled into Hank's dirt driveway and drove up to his farmhouse. He was already outside, standing on the porch, a flashlight in hand. His face looked worried, and that wasn't like him. I had known Hank basically my entire life. I tried to give him a friendly greeting, but I could tell by his face alone that he was worried. He pointed towards the field and said something's out there. He said he heard the cows making a ruckus, so he went to check it out. When he got there, they weren't moving, just standing there, eyes wide open, like they were scared stiff. He said he went further in, and he saw these flashing lights and heard this strange hum. He said he came back and then called us because he didn't know what else to do. I asked him what he meant by flashing lights and where he saw them. He said out past the cornfields. He pointed. He said I needed to go see it for myself. I nodded, telling him to wait on the porch while I checked it out. I walked out into the field, shining my flashlight over the cows. They were standing perfectly still, just like Hank said. Their eyes were wide open, and they were trembling. I'd never seen cows act like that before. I walked further, pushing through the herd, moving towards the cornfield. The night felt heavier as I stepped into the cornfield. The stalks towered over me, and everything seemed darker. I told myself it was just my imagination. But then the light flashed. A soft, pulsing light, just up ahead. My heart started to race. I pushed further into the corn, the light growing brighter, a strange hum filling the air. It wasn't a sound I could identify, just a low, steady vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest. I reached the source of the light, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. I don't know why, but I just happened to look up, and then I saw it. A triangular craft, hovering silently above the field, with a yellow ring of light underneath it. It was maybe 100 feet above me, just floating there, completely still. I froze, staring at this object in the sky. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of trick, a hallucination. The light pulsed faster, the hum growing louder, and then suddenly, it all stopped. The light went out and the hum disappeared. The craft hung out in the air for a second longer, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Not like it flew away, like just disappeared into thin air. I stood there, staring up at the sky, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just witnessed. After a few minutes, I forced myself to move. I turned back, making my way out of the cornfield and back to Hank's farmhouse. The cows were moving again, acting like nothing had happened. I reached the porch, my hands shaking, still trying to make sense of it all. Hank was standing there on his porch. He asked if I saw anything. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. So I asked him if he saw the lights again while I was in the cornfield. He looked at me puzzled. Lights? What lights? He asked. I just stared at him for a moment. I said, the flashing lights you told me about. The ones you saw in the field? He frowned, scratching his head. He said, I don't remember any lights. I just remember the cows were acting funny. Did I call you out here for something? My heart skipped a beat. I told him he called me out here because he saw flashing lights and heard a strange sound. He stood there, and then shook his head, almost looking dazed. He said he didn't remember any lights or even calling. He kept apologizing. I stared at him, my mind racing. How could he not remember? Had he forgotten everything? We called him Old Man Hank for a reason, but this was completely out of character for him to forget something like this. Hank was visibly confused. He apologized again and said he just needed to go to bed. He walked back inside and shut the door. I just stood there for a moment, trying to comprehend the last 30 minutes. I just couldn't come up with any explanation for everything that had just happened. I hurried back to my car, my mind spinning. I sat there for a minute, trying to decide what I was going to tell dispatch. Do I tell them I just saw a UFO, and that Hank suddenly forgot that he had even called? Just thinking about it made me feel crazy. I just decided to tell them it was a false alarm, nothing to worry about. I picked up the radio and informed Brenda that the farm call was a false alarm and nothing to worry about. A few minutes later, she responded. She asked me what I was talking about. She sounded really confused. I said, the call about the farm. You asked me to check out Old Man Hank's possible intruder situation. Brenda then said, Mike, I never sent you to a farm. We haven't had any calls tonight. I dropped the radio, my hands shaking. Had I just imagined the whole thing? Had everyone but me just forgotten? I sat there in my car, staring out into the darkness, knowing that everyone else might forget what happened that night, but I never would.